I thought of something when I heard some of the other speakers speak, and this isn't exactly the sort of presentation you throw jokes into, so I'll just tell a story instead. They say start with a joke, I'll start with a story. When I was penning this, or what it would have been, I was working on my back deck at Powell, and feverishly writing in longhand as these moments of inspiration struck me, and one of those wild Wyoming winds came up and carried my nice presentation away over the fence, across the street, into a field where I searched for it for the next 2 hours in despair. I'm sure there were neighbors and other people from Powell wondering what that guy was doing out in the field as the farmer came in to start to prepare it for planting. But what it did was it redirected me to a sort of different focus, which I'm now grateful for. So today I'm going to speak about the productivity of misery, that being a pretty prime example. So I direct a World War II National Historic Landmark site about 14 miles from here. And it has little to do with the nation's triumph in that conflict, and instead has to do with a grave mistake. In short, it has to do with misery. We focus on an injustice done by our government on its own people that led to the incarceration of Japanese Americans on the West Coast. 120,000 of them. 14,000 of them ended up very close to here in the shadow of Heart Mountain. Because of their ancestry and because they looked like the enemy, they were rounded up, herded like cattle, and sent on trains to 10 confinement camps across the country. It's important to note three things. They were not told where they were going. They were not told how long they would be there. And they were imprisoned without being charged with a crime, despite 2/3 of them being American-born citizens. That represented the shattering of the collective dream of 80% of the Japanese American population in the nation. Now, in the end, not a single case of espionage was committed against the government by the Japanese Americans, punctuating how unfounded their incarceration was. But despite this, they discovered when the war was over, racism in the United States was not over, which added insult to injury as they desperately tried to rebuild their lives. Heart Mountain remained open late until November 1945 because some incarcerees were essentially squatting. They didn't have anything to go back to. So we have an interpretive center today where we focus on educating the public about this history, and we try to teach the lessons of the importance of social justice and of defending our Constitution in times of duress. So it is dark subject matter indeed. And I want to relay a conversation I had with recently with a resident from the area who drives by our center every day, but has never visited, oddly enough. She felt it was odd to have a museum commemorating this misery here. And I was sort of puzzled because I feel immense pride in what we do to take a site of injustice and make it one of education and community building. But she said, too depressing. And then she admitted something that was interesting to me. She admitted that because of things like the history of the camp, because of the suicide rate in Wyoming, because she felt the psyche of the people was too depressing, she almost didn't move here. So she was speaking to something that we rarely talk about in the open. The reality is suicide rates in Wyoming are about double the national average. We have a high teen death rate. We have high rates of drug abuse. Add to that our history, one that includes the displacement of Native people, one that includes the struggle of homesteaders, the Japanese American incarceration, ongoing gender inequality, and of course our chronic boom-bust mentality. All these have contributed to weaving an undercurrent of melancholy into what it means to live in this part of the West. So what do we do with this storehouse of misery? It's there just under the surface, believe me. What's our response to someone who says, well, that's too depressing? It's too easy to hide behind over-romanticized images and oversimplified slogans like the cowboy state, or the equality state, or forever West. So for now, for a few minutes, let's pull back the veneer. Let's reflect a little bit on our past and mine our miseries like we mine for our natural resources. From them, we have the opportunity to derive great strength and inspiration. And that is what we do every day at the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center. Because what you risk when you write something off as too depressing or too morose is the ability to learn from suffering. Viktor Frankl taught me that. Viktor Frankl was incarcerated himself during World War II, although in the Nazi camps. He was a psychologist and learned a great deal from his painful experience and asserted afterwards that even in the most absurd, painful, and dehumanizing situations, life has meaning, and therefore our suffering has meaning. So this is not a lemons to lemonade kind of suggestion. This is, I'm also not suggesting that you have to be miserable to find meaning in your lives. But I think it's fair to say that we all have our own miseries. We all have despaired. And to struggle, to suffer without meaning, that is often what plunges a person into the depths. But even in our depressing states, there's opportunity to find meaning and growth. So there's a somewhat new school of psychology that might help us look at depression in a new light. It does not see it as a defect or a disorder, but suggests it's a product of evolution. It says that depression is what is supposed to happen when we become overwhelmingly miserable. Our brain is telling us to stop, to recalibrate, and to recover. Because when we are in deep despair, everything else seems trivial. Cat videos, shopping, refreshing your Facebook page, these things fall to the wayside. There's a reason we shut down. It clears our brains from the clutter, so we can devote focused attention on this misery. Almost in the way our immune system responds to a virus, it reassigns all resources to the main problem. So think about that for a moment. Depression is your brain telling you to deal with those traumatic experiences in your life, to deal with loss, to deal with failure. Our misery will teach us, if we let it, how to deal with the subsequent struggles in our lives. I say if we let it because our modern response to depression is to look at it as a problem to be solved. We medicate it. We throw as many vices we can think of at it. We try to hide from it. Our modern world doesn't allow time for dealing with negative self-views or low self-esteem. So it's time to turn that around. Accept emotional pain as an impetus for growth and insight into ourselves and to our problems. In our misery, we should seek for deeper meaning. And we of the West, when misery overtakes us, need to remember we have tremendous things going for us. The West was built on hardship. So along with our misery came a wealth of perseverance, of hard work, of resilience. Our misery will continue to propel us forward if we let it. I am fascinated and inspired by this possibility. We also have Mr. Frankl, and we also have evolution going for us in that regard. I have studied this intensely because I, from time to time, like I would guess all of you, have suffered and struggled. And in the past, I too have made the mistake of trying to run from it. When you're in a mental state that makes putting pants on seem like parting the Red Sea, it's difficult to find clarity, to understand that your misery is trying to teach you something. I discovered that when you hide from depression, it grows and consumes you. And that our modern solution of medicating it may not be the answer. So I use these past struggles as an asset in my daily life to fuel my passion for my work at Heart Mountain, to take this so-called too depressing history and shape misery into inspiration. At Heart Mountain, I've learned the product of the incarceree's suffering is inspiration, and I strive to share that inspiration with as many people as I can. So in keeping with that mission, I'll close with a few triumphs that result directly from suffering at Heart Mountain. That is Norman Mineta. As a kid, Norm loved Boy Scouts and baseball. So when his family was forcibly removed from their home in San Jose in 1942, Norm packed his scout uniform and he packed his baseball bat in his glove. His Heart Mountain heartbreak began when he went to board the train to bring him here, and they confiscated his bat. They considered it a weapon. So he went on here without it. And his family went on to endure incarceration as stoically as they could, given the circumstances. And when they were released, they went back to San Jose. And Norm went on to get a good education and to discover some way he could work toward the public good. So he ended up becoming mayor of San Jose. Eventually Congress for the state of California, and then served 2 presidents as the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Transportation. His time at Heart Mountain didn't make him bitter. It spurred him on to a life of public service. It taught him never to take the word citizen for granted, because for 3 years, his nation had stripped that title from him. There are a lot of people in this picture, but the one I want you to focus on is the gentleman on the far left. That is Frank Goto. What Frank discovered while confined at Heart Mountain was his life's work. He developed a love for fossils and natural history. And in order to occupy his mind, he spent as much time as he could scouring the surrounding terrain. He became adept at spotting and carefully uncovering fossils. He eventually wrote to Princeton telling them how good he was at this and that they should give him a job. Well, they took him on after he was released. He ended up there. And what they found was this amateur, who learned his trade at a confinement camp, was incredibly skilled and enthusiastic. Now, Frank remains a legend at the New Jersey State Museum for the fossils that he uncovered and prepared. The pieces he worked on are treasures of paleontology. And finally, I want to talk about Sam Mihara. Sam is in the middle of the picture here, and that is a dilapidated barrack on the side of him there. Sam's family had a number of tragedies befall him during camp. His grandfather, he had cancer and died in camp. He was being treated at the time with Pepto-Bismol. His father had glaucoma, and without access to the specialist that he was seeing in San Francisco to help him fight it off, he went blind in camp. But they persevered, again, as best they could, and they eventually were released and went back to the West Coast. Sam's father went on to devote himself to developing Japanese Braille. Sam went on to get the best education he could and became a rocket scientist, seeming to put this misery behind him. But obviously, a level of misery this great is hard to forget. So here's how Sam decided to make use of it, as he's now retired. He serves on the Heart Mountain board, but he now spends all his spare time delivering presentations about his Heart Mountain hardship. Sam spends his retirement reliving the agony of his family's time at Heart Mountain, answering question after question. He derives great strength from this activity. He believes that if he can move people with his story, we can inch our world just a little bit closer to one in which this sort of injustice never happens again. So Norm and Frank and Sam and the thousands of others incarcerated, they could have assumed the role of victims. They were, after all, victims of a great injustice. They could have allowed the difficulty of their situation to swallow them. They could have responded with anger. But they chose instead to claim the injustice and to claim their misery. Rather than let this experience define them, they chose to define their experience. I call that pure inspiration brought out by misery. Thank you.